Welcome to Echo Ekoji. I'm Andrea Chapman here with my co-host Joe Gochi. We're excited to bring you another inspiring episode in our second season, spotlighting the voices of the Ekoji community and diving into Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. Ekoji Buddhist Temple in Fairfax Station, Virginia is your hub for spiritual engagement, both in person and online. Join our Sunday services at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, and don't miss our Dharma Breeze sessions with Reverend Kurt Rai on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific via Zoom. Check out our seminars, discussions, meditation sessions, and Obon Summer Festival held annually during the month of July. Visit ekoji.org for more info. Joe, what makes Ekoji so special?
Thanks, Andrea. There's a lot that makes Ekoji special. Ekoji is part of the Buddhist Churches of America, a network of 60 Jodo Shinshu temples across the United States. We cherish the teachings of Amida Buddha and the three Pure Land Sutras, as shared by Shinran Shonin, a 13th century Japanese Pure Land Buddhist. We express our gratitude and take refuge in Amida Buddha through the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Our mission is to spread Amida Buddha's wisdom and compassion, leading us to spiritual fulfillment, self-reflection, and a life of gratitude. And it's time to introduce our next guest.
Today, we are happy to welcome Nick Karen, an Ekoji Sangha member and current member of the temple's board of directors. Welcome, Nick. Can you share a bit about your background and what drew your family to the Southern Alameda County Buddhist Church in Union City, California?
Glad to be on here today. So originally, my background, my mom is Vietnamese American and my dad is Caucasian American. And I believe we grew up in the Fremont, California, San Francisco Bay Area, and back in California, I think, and I lived there for about the first 10 years or so of my life. And so during that time, I think my mom really wanted a sense of foundation for my family. And I think we were debating on either going to a Christian church or going to a Buddhist temple, because my dad had grown up Lutheran Christian, but my mom had grown up Vietnamese Buddhist, kind of just attending temple back in Vietnam for all the big holidays and celebrations. But kind of like we weren't, I guess, regular churchgoers up until maybe I hit first grade. So in preschool / elementary school, we had met a really nice Japanese American family who I'm still like best childhood friends with today. And my mom found out through my friend's parent that he's like, oh, we have this Japanese temple just like 5 minutes down the road from our house. Come check it out. And so we checked out their local temple. My mom liked how the services were in English and they had all the structure with all the different programs like the Boy Scouts, and there's like a Japanese basketball league and some other programs that enabled kind of like for our family being like Asian American, because I didn't really speak any other language other than English, to kind of learn about Buddhism and have a good structure and foundation with the temple. And yeah, lo and behold, now what is it, 20 years later, almost 19 years later, here I am like still a member of Jodo Shinshu and also like leading some leadership stuff around the temple. Yeah, so that's a little bit of background on that.
That's terrific, Nick. Hey, it's really a pleasure to meet you today. And before we start or continue the formal interview, were you at last Sunday's Hotsubon service at Ekoji?
Yes, I was.
Well, I was out near Seattle watching it on Zoom, and I was delighted, almost gobsmacked, when Reverend Nagata ended his Dharma message, and he thanked all the people who had volunteered at the previous day's Bonadori Festival. And he knew that many had missed the dancing and invited everyone attending to get up and to join Nori Nakamura, who would teach and lead them in the coal miners dance. I'm very familiar with the coal miners dance. There must have been 100 people who got up and encircled all the seating at Ekoji inside the Hondo. So the question I have for you is, what was it like to be in that moment?
It was a great feeling, to be honest with you, because I think, at least for me growing up, going to Southern Alameda, we never really attended Obon, just because usually we were out during August when they have their Obon Odori. So when we moved over to Ekoji in Virginia, we had always participated like in the Obon Odori Festival, helping to fundraise and do everything there. But like myself and many other people, I've been a member there for, I don't know, 10 plus years. And every single oboe, I'm always working, either making bento boxes, running around doing shaved ice, doing trash. So I never get the chance to dance. And I think it was really special feeling to be able to like, oh, I was also like, oh, I get to dance this oboe notary. This is great. Like actually, and have that moment to actually enjoy with everybody because, typically everyone's working, but we had that moment to enjoy everybody in the service, everybody in the Sangha got to enjoy that oboe notary dance like in the moment. And it was very special to actually feel that connection because a lot of people don't get to experience that. And for a lot of the newcomers, I think that even though they don't know maybe about all the traditions of Obon, they just feel like instinctually like, oh, they feel they're within this oneness with everybody else and connected with everybody. And it was really special feeling to be able to have that like the first time in, I don't know, 10 years or so. Even one of our longtime Sangha members, Jane Bleckman, she was sitting next to me in the service. She's like, I've never danced to Obon and I've been here forever. So I think a lot of us really like cherish that moment.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Uh, how did your move to Virginia, and you talked about the discovery then of Ekoji Buddhist Temple, how did that impact your engagement with Buddhism?
I think initially when I first got involved in Jodo Shinshu, when I went to Southern Alameda County Buddhist Church in the Bay Area, like I think I left when I was maybe like 11 or 12. And I think at that time as a kid, you probably don't know about all the details and the doctrines and everything of Buddhism. So I was like, oh, okay, we're just switching temples from one temple in California to one in Virginia. It shouldn't be that much of a culture change and everything. Because I remember in California, I think I did attend Dharma school regularly, but it was at the elementary level. So I think, we were still in kind of the arts and crafts phase and our like elementary learning about the principles of Buddhism, about like, oh, who is Shinran Shonin? Who is Siddhartha? Like, what are the Four Noble Truths? What's the story of the Four Gates? Things like that. And so I think it's when I moved over to Koji, that's when I hit middle school. And I remember like moving and first coming over here and seeing all the culture shock of being outside of California, moving to Virginia. And then we started getting involved in Dharma school, and it was at the intermediate level. And over here, it's like, oh, we're discussing about like the more like intermediate topics about how Buddhism applies to our daily life and how, what do we like, what's our opinion on the teachings of what happened back then and how it relates to now. And it was really kind of like mind blowing to me to think like, oh, we can actually like question all the teachings and I can like use this basis as like a guide for my life rather than like I thought it was just kind of like, oh, you do as you're told and you listen to all the teachings and you kind of just follow it verbatim. But it was like, oh no, you can like question and learn and develop your own thinking and your own theory, and then you can disagree with all the teachings being said as well. I, I can specifically remember Mr. Nakamura, who was my Dharma school teacher for about, I don't know, forever, probably middle school through all the way through high school, saying like, oh, at any point you guys can stop me and say, all these teachings we're talking about, like, I want to hear your opinion. Like, you guys can say it's a bunch of crap, but like hypothetically, and I remember he said that verbatim, and I was like, wow, okay, wow, I didn't know you could say that. And to be like, oh, okay, like I had no idea that people could disagree with the teachings, and it was still like that's like still being unapologetically Jodo Shinshu. And I had no idea that was crazy.
So, Nick, you've talked a little bit about your experiences with Dharma School, but how would you say that it has shaped your understanding of Buddhism?
For me, I guess like growing up, a lot of people, at least in like today's Western Judeo-Christian society, probably think of like, oh, um, a lot of other people who I know are Buddhist, quote unquote, like they probably just go to service or go to temple during like either maybe a funeral service or some big holiday, and they may say they're Buddhist, but they don't know exactly about all the teachings and everything that intertwines with it. And I think a lot of times, like a lot of the questions people ask when they find out I'm a Buddhist, they say like, oh, so is the Buddha a god? Is the Buddha this? Is the Buddha that? And I guess a lot of the topics we always talked about too is sometimes when I do encounter that, sometimes I maybe interact with like a Christian person who maybe say like something along the lines of like, oh, like, well, since you're not a follower of Christianity, that means like, you might you might be like going to hell because like you don't follow the words of Jesus Christ. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't know that. But I think I remember like I was asked that question when I was doing during one of my Dharma school some Dharma school sessions by my Dharma school teacher. And we talked about that. It's like, how would you react to that kind of question? And I remember I responded some lines of like, oh, well, I don't have to get into a fight or like, what is it? Like be argumentative and like tell people how to do. Cause I think I remember I heard during one of the sessions, someone saying like, oh, I think like Christianity is kind of like, oh, like the doctrines to kind of fill the void of silence in our communities, when Buddhism, and in fact, it tells us to kind of like to just stop and listen to the reasoning and just like listen and visualize and like try to take in all the world around us to make our own image and everything. So I remember just responding and being like, oh, like that's okay, that's fine. But I still have like my guide, I have Siddhartha Gautama, he's another leader in our community. And like just like how this person might follow Jesus Christ in a different faith, that doesn't mean he's a bad person or anything. I just think like maybe he doesn't understand like my reasoning, I don't understand his, and I really hope like the best for that person. And I remember that was kind of one of the more groundbreaking approaches for me to really understand virtue and compassion in my daily life, because I could have just reacted with like a visceral reaction saying, oh, well, this person, is wrong and all this stuff. But no, I had to take it on to be like, oh, no, I had to see the reasoning and understand like I need to show compassion and virtue in this moment because this person's also a human being and has their own opinion and life guide and whatnot. But so it's kind of like, oh, we're all together connected in this oneness. So I'm not trying to spend any bad mojo or bad karma around. So yeah.
Very good. Thanks.
That's a beautiful approach, Nick. Thank you for sharing.
Really is. Nick, there are a lot of people who will watch this interview and they may be new to Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. They may be a teenager or a young adult, and they may not know what the acronyms are. So what is Yak, and how did your participation in Yak, a Yak retreat, and completing the Sangha Award influence or shape your understanding and practice of Buddhism?
So the Yak Retreat, or the Yak program of what it was called. So the Yak, or spelled YAC, not YAK, not like the animal. It's a acronym for YAC, or Yak, or YAC Retreat. So Yak stands for, the Y stands for youth, the A stands for advocacy, and then C stands for committee. So it was like the Youth Advocacy Committee Retreat, or Yak Retreat. And then they had a series of numbers depending on like, oh, this is like the first iteration of the Yak program, the second iteration, and so forth. So I was part of the Yak 11 retreat. So I was like the 11th year the Yak program commenced, which was in 2015, I believe. So the Yak program was basically how a lot of the sort of resident ministers or certified ministers assistants, they all have a certification called the Tokudo, which is kind of like your formal training that you study and get certain certifications from BCA. And then I think you believe in go get officially ordained in Japan. And I think that's like, oh, you're more like, the official title of like, oh, you're certified as a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist minister. So I think what some of the ministers at the Sacramento Buddhist Church in California had was like, oh, what if we created kind of like a mini Tokudo kind of retreat to enable some of the youth to feel like they have a sense of more like ownership and kind of like belonging to temple, and also can like also be taught to be leaders in Jodo Shinshu in their temple. So we kind of did like a mini Tokudo series where it's like for 1 week we went to Sacramento, the Sacramento Buddhist Church, and I went on behalf of Ekoji, and there are a couple other participants from the other California, Washington and Oregon temples as well. And we kind of all did, service training and also dive deep and kind of like into our basic understanding of Buddhism, and then gradually elevated it to like intermediate and advanced concepts, and about like how we can learn about Jodo Shinshu, how it applies to daily life, and how we can all lead the services properly and how to act in the service. Because I think before that retreat, I remember kind of like, oh, I didn't know how to like properly hold a book, or how to like offer it to your head when you do the offering, or maybe how you're supposed to chant and pronounce some of the vowels, because they're all in Japanese, not being a not native Japanese speaker. So it's like, oh, they taught us all the basics that way, like, oh, this is how they do it at the main temple in Japan. And so we could be as close as possible to kind of like keeping the service to the way it is. And after seeing and participating in that retreat, it was kind of like a big eye-opening, awakening moment to me. And I was like, oh, Jodo Shinshu is actually like a lot more pertinent and relevant to my daily life than I think it is. And now I can, help and spread that message. And hopefully if it resonates with someone else, they can also, follow in the same footsteps that I'm taking my Buddhist path in. So yeah, it's great.
Excellent. Thank you.
So, Nick, you have a lot of valuable roles at Ekoji. Can you tell us what roles you have served in and how these roles have influenced your personal and spiritual journey?
So some of the roles I helped out with Ekoji, I guess like, recently I've been a Dharma School teacher for the intermediate level. I've helped out a bit with like the services, with doing some of the youth minister or lay Dharma leader type things involving like doing concho, giving Dharma talks occasionally, and also helping with just the leading of the service. Currently, I'm an at-large board member on the Ekoji exec board, kind of just to help facilitate the planning and overall programming of the temple to help Ekoji moving forward with the overall mission of like, helping Jodo Shinshu spread and propagate in Virginia. And also, I'm one of the co-presidents with my partner in crime, Wyatt Spage, for the Koji YBA to help kind of like help with the adults, young adults in their ranges like 18 to 40 to learn a bit more about Jodo Shinshu and have a community here at Ekoji. And just recently after Obon, I was part of the Obon committee, so I was helping out with grounds. So that was pretty cool. So yeah, those are the couple of things I've been kind of like participating at in Ekoji. And it sounds like a lot, but I think it just sounds like it's kind of like, oh, I wear just multiple hats sometimes. And it's more just like, oh, since I've been here for so long, it's just like attending another meeting. And I do have my moments where I feel like, oh, I might have like, burned myself out doing all these things. But every time I see like, oh, a new member join, or I see like, the events and the people who are kind of like maybe new to Buddhism and getting really involved in YBA or learning about Buddhism and Dharma School, or like, seeking guidance and really appreciating how I help them in service, it makes it all worth it in the moment. And, sometimes you have to look for those moments of sweetness and, this life of samsara. So it's really tough, but, you got to take those moments when you can.
Nick, I want to dive deeper into that answer. In an email exchange that you and I had, you mentioned that you have, and I will admit to having it as well at times, a love-hate relationship with being a really active, devoted temple member. Can you elaborate on the challenges and rewards of temple involvement? And how can temples like Ekoji, and I'd even say like Seattle, because our Sangha is quite elderly if you take a look at the entire group. So how can temples like Ekoji protect members from what I might call voluntary exhaustion?
That's definitely one of those like terms that has popped up in front of my head, especially this past previous month with Omo. And
Mm.
like sometimes I do worry about, oh, when I go on leave or I'm taking vacation, if I'm worrying like, oh, I wonder how the like, not just my regular job or family responsibilities. Sometimes I wonder, oh, what's the temple going to do? How are they going to do this and this? Who's going to take over for this responsibility? And yeah, like voluntary exhaustion is definitely something that's been at the top of my mind, because there are some times where I'm like, oh, I like really love to go to temple these days. And there's sometimes where I'm like, oh, I may be dreading out of bed, like, I have to go to temple, but it's okay. It's just one of those days and I'll get over the hump and keep pushing through. So I guess one of the ways is like when new members are coming to the temple, I think it's really important that as a leader, because I have been in some leadership positions, and I think this is a message that kind of resonates with a lot of the other leaders at Ekoji, is like to listen to the new members and find out like what exactly maybe draws them to Buddhism and what's like empowering them, and that what they envision in Buddhism, and how like, what's kind of like charging up and filling up their glass to feel like fulfilled, to feel like, oh, want to pursue and learn about Jodo Shinshu. And I think it's kind of like inspiring them and then capturing that inspiration and putting like, them in a role that they can feel like they can succeed in a Koji. And it's like, oh, they are always feeling passion because they never feel burnt out, because they're always pursuing their passion in the temple. And then helping like, there's going to be some people who are probably going to be more leaders, some people who are going to be more along the follower aspect, but everyone kind of has that, maybe that internal flame that has to be ignited by a leader within the temple. And then we can all be drawn together and keep, pursuing the Dharma passion, our Dharma passions together. And I think it is difficult to see that, see that vision initially, but I think it's like, as long as we start that conversation with some of the members and enable them to get into different groups, like the YBA, if they're a young member, or if in Dharma school, if they're in elementary school, or, in the service, if they, are a newcomer, that kind of thing, that they can feel like, oh, their voice is heard, and maybe what they're envisioning is being kind of developed at a Koji, and they're all following their passions. And we feel like we can also like channel that inspiration, and maybe someone else feels the same way, and we can all work in the same direction together. And I think that's really important to help, even though some of the older members might be, maybe not used to like the new methods of like the younger generations. I think we have to kind of learn how to, work with that and accept like, hey, this is part of change and how the Sangha is changing. We have to adapt with the times in order to bring in new people that we can keep Jodo Shinshu alive for as long as we can and keep it going forward.
So, Nick, let's reflect on all the Dharma messages you have ever heard and choose your number one favorite and why.
Okay. Let me think of a really good one that's on the top of my head. Okay. There was one where I think I was listening to a Zoom of Reverend Hayashi when I was in college, maybe 2, 3 years ago. But I remember the quote. He said something along the lines of like, a wise man is to assume like knows he is like, not wise, but a fool is to assume he's a wise man. And when he said that, I was like, that is the most real thing I have ever heard in my life. And then there's times when I go on in life and I think I've resaid that quote or I've told people about that and they're like, oh, Nick, you sound very wise. And I was like, I know, right? My life has just changed with that quote. I had a totally different observation and outlook on my life. And I have so many principles on kind of like, oh, it's the whole thing of maybe thinking like from the Jodo, it's kind of reminds me of the whole Jodo perspective of just like being, reminding yourself to like listen to the reasoning around you in the world before you kind of say something and try to like, oh, look to the reasonings of the world and try to collect our reasonings together before we say something that comes out of our mouth, rather than just make a quick assumption and just assume we know everything, we know the best, or you think, oh, it's this whole thing where it kind of reminds you of like, oh, assuming you're like the most wise person is like your ego, and assuming like, oh, I am the most smart person in the world. I am like have the biggest ego ever. But it's taking that moment to pause and understand, oh, we don't have, we're not the wisest people in the world. And maybe my ego isn't so, as important as I think it should be. And I need to listen to like listen to the world around us. So that quote has just reverberated with me like ever since I heard that.
So you're a board member at large at Ekoji. How do you envision the future of Ekoji and the broader Jodo Shinshu community of America? What do you see in our futures?
I'm still kind of figuring that out. But there are times where I believe like Jodo Shinshu, I keep hearing about how in our faith, like kind of like, oh, it's like, we want the more voice of the younger members within our congregation to kind of speak up. That way they feel they have a voice and sense of community in a Koji and like within the greater Jodo Shinshu community. And I think I want to say about a year ago, last September, I didn't really see the point of maybe let's say having a Young Buddhist Association. But I remember I just told Wyatt how great the YBA was. I really sold it to him and he really felt really inspired. He's like, hey, we should start a YBA. And then I was like, at the moment, I was like, nah, it's so much work and effort, and I don't feel like our voice is gonna matter. But a year later, I keep hearing about from all the new YBA members we have, like people who have joined a Koji in the past year and other active members who are kind of like didn't really feel like that a sense of youth presence feel so like a Koji is their own place and they feel a lot more involved and dedicated to help out the temple. And I was like, wow, this is so cool that I've helped in the part of like creating a sense of community for like a Sangha that maybe didn't feel like they were that involved. So part of my vision is kind of like engaging the youth and people at my age who maybe don't feel like they have a voice to know that like, oh, you do have a voice. You just need to speak up and there is a safe space for you to kind of talk about Buddhism and be involved in the community. I guess one of the big things is I really want to help empowering the youth to kind of speak up more and be more involved in temple and having more advocacy from people who are in my age bracket and younger. That way we can hear like the different generations of people getting involved in Jodo Shinshu. And hopefully like, they can inspire others to keep our denomination moving forward. So that's my vision.
Excellent. Thank you.
And we are so grateful for both you and Wyatt's efforts with the YBA. They are really an instrumental part of Ekoji. So thank you for spearheading that.
Nick, this is my last question for this interview process. I just want to tell you how enjoyable this has been. And I think the future of not just Ekoji, but BCA temples around the country are looking to people like you, your age, that under 40 group that needs to be fully engaged at this time. And I'm going to ask you at this time to put on your professional hat. I was once told that a nonprofit is a nonprofit in name only. If they don't turn a profit, they go out of business. And our temples are always in the business, if you will, of trying to survive and move forward to propagate the Dharma. So as a business analyst, what advice might you offer temples like Ekoji that'll help them remain viable into the distant future?
So for example, at Ekoji, we just have this new industrial kitchen, and a lot of members are always talking about ways we can maybe like, oh, find ways to like rent it out to other like, and people who need industrial kitchen space anyway. That way it can keep the, Ekoji open, and we can use that profit to maybe help like, prosper different Dharma activities. Or we can have like more fundraisers through YBA to kind of like help other YBA members who maybe can't afford a membership, or maybe keep it open that way. Like we can all plan a trip together, because people maybe might not have the ability to like, go on this cool trip unless we fundraise. So maybe like finding more fundraising opportunities to keep the overall temple moving forward.
Thank you.
Fundraising is definitely key in a nonprofit. So, Nick, we always end our interviews with the same question. What does Ekoji mean to you?
For me, I think recently Ekoji has always meant family, and it's always meant community, and it's always meant that no matter what state I am in my life, I always have a sense of purpose, and no matter what direction I take my life, because there's no right or wrong direction to take. And you'll always have like a purpose in Jodo Shinshu as a guide. And no matter like what, like, it's okay for, I'm okay as the person in my ups and my downs. And I'll always feel like, I'll always have like the teachings of Amida and the teachings of Dharma to help guide me through my life, no matter what. So yeah, that's what coaching means to me.
Thank you, Nick. If you enjoyed today's episode, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Connect with us on Facebook and Instagram for updates on our services and programs. For more resources, visit ekoji.org, Buddhist Churches of America.org, and Buddhist Temples of Canada at bcc.ca. Whether you're someone who is curious, a committed layperson, or a serious Buddhist scholar, bdkamerica.org offers an amazing array of print and digital resources. Ekoji's mission is to foster global unity within the Sangha through our gatherings and streaming services. A heartfelt thank you to Nick Karen for joining us today. I'm Andrea Chapman with Joe Gochi. On behalf of Ekoji Buddhist Temple, we appreciate your support. Namo Amida Butsu.
Butsu.